Perhaps you would not have noticed the first signs had you been there in the final weeks of 1708. The days were already short, the nights stretching long over Europe's towns and villages. But there was something else in the air, a stillness, the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched, though there is nothing to see. In the fields, the last of the harvest lay bundled, frost already licking the edges of the stalks. A thin sheet of ice crept across the shallow ponds, not thick enough to bear weight, but enough to seal the fish beneath in a silent glass. No one imagined then that this was only the beginning, that in the weeks to come, the air itself would seem to harden. When the year turned, it was as if a door had closed behind it. The first week of January brought a sharp frost, and then another still. Each day was colder than the last. Farmers found the water in their pails solid before dawn. Merchants in the cities wrapped their stalls in woolen cloth, hoping to protect their goods from the icy breath that seemed to creep into every crack and seam. The poor huddled in the narrow lanes, clustering close to the few fires still burning. The wealthier families retreated to the inner rooms of their homes, curtains drawn, shutters latched. It was not only the chill they feared, but the wind, which came low and steady, carrying with it a strange, dry snow that stung the eyes. And yet, for a time, people believed it would pass. Winters could be harsh. This one was simply a little worse than most. They told themselves it would break in a week or two. But as January deepened, the cold tightened its grip. In Paris, the Seine froze bank to bank, its surface marked by dark lines where the ice had cracked and refrozen. In Vienna, the Danube lay silent and white, the great river reduced to a single unbroken sheet. In the countryside, travelers reported that wells were frozen solid, their buckets locked in place by ice so thick it took hours of hacking to free them. It was a strange thing to live in such weather. Bread grew hard almost as soon as it was baked. Wine turned thick and slushy in its casks. Oil congealed in its lamps. In some houses, frost formed on the inside of the windows, delicate patterns of fern and feather that caught the morning light in pale, brittle beauty. But this beauty was cruel. Behind it lay hunger and the slow, creeping danger of the cold. There were stories of animals found frozen standing where they had paused to drink, their muzzles locked in ice. Birds fell from the sky, their wings stiffened in mid-beat. In the forests, deer pressed close together in great herds, moving little, conserving what warmth they could. And in the towns, the people did much the same. The streets emptied except for those desperate enough to risk the air. Even the sounds were changed. Snow and frost swallowed footsteps, and the wind carried voices farther than they should have traveled, so that a conversation 2 streets away seemed to come from just beyond the next corner. The bells of the churches rang dull and heavy, the air too dense to let their notes carry freely. At night, the cold was almost a living thing. It pressed against the walls, slipped beneath doors, reached through shutters. Fires had to be kept constantly fed, yet even so, their heat seemed to vanish before it could fill a room. It was said that during those first weeks, time itself slowed. Days dragged, nights stretched impossibly long. People rose later, for there was no reason to face the cold until the light had at least begun to rise. And even then, work was half-hearted. What was the point of mending a roof when the snow would only freeze to the tiles? Why walk to market if the food was as hard as the coins that would pay for it? Life turned inward, smaller, as though the cold had not only shrunk the world, but pressed it in upon itself. And all the while, it grew colder still. There were those who believed it was a punishment. Priests spoke in hushed voices of divine judgment, the sins of nations drawing down the breath of heaven in the form of frost. In some places, processions were held despite the cold, the faithful walking barefoot through the snow, carrying candles that guttered in the wind. In others, the churches stayed full, not only for prayer, but because the stone walls, crowded with bodies, offered a little more warmth than an empty home. In the countryside, some whispered of darker causes, witches working in covens to draw winter deeper, binding the sun so it could not climb high enough to melt the ice. It was easy to believe such things when the days stayed so dim, the light thin and pale, as though it had traveled from another, colder world. In the villages, the old remedies were brought out, bowls of glowing embers placed beneath the bed to keep the frost from settling on the sheets, stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth to rest at one's feet during the night, straw packed into the gaps of the walls to stop the drafts. In the towns, the bakers rose earlier still, stoking their ovens long before dawn so the heat would drive away the chill from their own bones. But these were only small victories. The cold was not content to stay at the edges. It came inside. The frost began to claim the wells entirely. It is hard to imagine now what it meant for a village to lose its water in winter, when there were no pumps, no pipes to bring it from elsewhere. Men with axes and iron bars spent hours hacking at the frozen surface, only to find the water beneath locked away by another layer deeper still. Livestock were lost to thirst as much as to cold. The snow was plentiful, yes, but melting it was slow and costly, each pot of water needing precious wood or coal to bring it to heat. And wood was running out. Forests close to the cities were stripped bare. Carts groaned under the weight of green logs hauled from far afield. But green wood burned poorly, hissing and spitting, giving more smoke than warmth. In poorer quarters, anything burnable was fed to the hearth. Furniture, broken beams, old doors torn from their hinges. The cold left marks not just on the body, but on the mind. There are diary entries from the time that speak of a strange quiet in people's thoughts, as though their minds had slowed to match the frozen world outside. One man in the Low Countries wrote of spending an entire day staring at the frost creeping across his window, unable to will himself to move. A Parisian seamstress noted that she no longer dreamed at night. She thought perhaps the cold had frozen even that. And yet, despite all this, life did not stop entirely. There were markets, smaller now, with fewer goods, but still they were held. Children still played, their laughter turned to white clouds in the air. Couples walked together, gloved hands clasped, leaning into one another for warmth. The frost fair on the Thames was lit by torches at night, stalls glowing like little islands of warmth in a black sea of ice. People clung to these moments as proof that the world had not ended, that spring would, in time, return. But if you had been there in the middle of that January, standing in a street muffled in snow, hearing nothing but the wind and the soft crack of ice breaking somewhere out of sight, you might have wondered if spring was a story the world had forgotten. The frost was no respecter of persons. He claimed the old and the young alike, those who labored in the fields and those who dwelled behind stone walls. Reports from the countryside tell of entire villages swallowed by snowdrifts so deep they vanished from the maps for a time. Livestock perished by the thousands, their bodies frozen in the pastures, hoofs stiff and breath caught in ice. Crops, barely sown or waiting to be harvested, were lost to the relentless cold, dooming many families to hunger in the months ahead. In cities, the cold reached into every corner. Pipes, where they existed, burst beneath the weight of ice. Wells and fountains froze dry. The poor huddled in attics and cellars, layering wherever scraps of cloth they could find, sharing warmth in desperate solidarity. The sick and elderly faced a cruel choice between freezing in place or braving the biting wind to seek help. Inns and taverns filled beyond capacity, the scent of wood smoke mixing with stale breath and the occasional cough that spoke of unseen illnesses. Travel was nearly impossible. Roads were choked with snow and ice. Horses faltered or fell, their riders abandoning them to the cold. Caravans stopped mid-journey, goods spoiled or lost to frost. The mail slowed to a crawl, and news from far-flung regions became delayed, feeding rumors and fear. Still, the world turned, and life found its rhythms even in such harsh conditions. Villagers held on to old customs to keep hope alive, gathering around the fire to tell stories, singing songs to ward off despair. In the towns, market days became brief affairs, more about community and support than commerce. Children fashioned little snow sculptures, unaware of the peril beyond their games, and all around, the land lay wrapped in a ghostly white shroud, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. For many, this winter was not merely cold, but a battle against an invisible foe, an unyielding force that tested the limits of human endurance and spirit. Perhaps the chill of the winter had seeped so deeply into the bones of the people that even their hearts felt the cold. Letters and journals from the time reveal a growing weariness, a slow dimming of hope beneath the relentless frost. One merchant in Lyon wrote of waking each morning to find his breath hanging in the air like a ghost, his fingers numb as he tried to grasp the quill. A farmer's wife in a remote hamlet noted the silence outside her window, broken only by the creak of frozen branches and the distant howling of wolves emboldened by hunger. The cold was not merely a physical presence. It had become a weight on the soul, pressing down as surely as the snow piled high against doors and walls. Communities pulled closer, sharing what little warmth and food they had left. Fires burned low but steady in hearths across the land, their glow a fragile barrier against the encroaching frost. People exchanged whispered prayers and superstitions, hoping to coax the sun to return. Some believed the cold was a test, a trial set by the heavens to judge their worthiness. Others whispered darker tales, of spirits trapped beneath the ice, of ancient curses awakened by mankind's sins. In the small hours of the night, when the world seemed utterly still, one might have imagined the frost itself was alive, creeping ever closer, intent on claiming all it touched. Yet amid the hardship, there were moments of strange beauty. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from rooftops, catching the pale winter light and scattering it in 1,000 fragile rainbows. The world was silent, but for the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional distant call of a lone bird braving the cold. This was a land transformed, both hostile and hauntingly lovely, a place where survival was as much about spirit as flesh. The winter of 1709 left scars deeper than frostbite and hunger. Tales tell of people who, driven by desperation, risked crossing frozen rivers only to fall through brittle ice, swallowed by the dark waters beneath. In towns, infants were bundled tightly in furs and wool, their tiny breaths visible in the cold air, while elders whispered stories meant to calm fears and pass the long nights. The cold was a great equalizer, indifferent to wealth or status. Nobles retreated behind thick tapestries and blazing hearths, but even they could not escape the relentless grip of the frost. Meanwhile, the natural world responded in kind. Forests lay dormant beneath heavy blankets of snow, the silence broken only by the snap of frozen branches. Wildlife faced a cruel scarcity. Many animals perished, while others migrated or hibernated in desperate attempts to survive. In some places, rivers that had never frozen before stood solid and unyielding, trapping fish and blocking transport. The cold reshaped the very landscape, molding it into a frozen sculpture of hardship and endurance. Throughout this time, human resilience showed in small, quiet ways. Villagers shared whatever food they had, farmers tended to weakened animals with care, and communities gathered in candlelit rooms to preserve warmth and companionship. Stories were told and retold, carrying hope like flickering flames against the darkness. And so the winter, though cruel, also became a crucible, testing the limits of endurance and binding people together in shared hardship. The turning point came slowly, as the days began to stretch imperceptibly longer, and the sun's pale light gained a faint warmth. It was not a sudden thaw, but a creeping retreat, a gradual easing of the frost's hold. Ice began to melt, rivers once again flowed free, and the snow's pristine white softened into muddy slush. Fields, though battered and barren, promised the return of life in time. Yet the memory of that winter lingered, etched into the fabric of the communities that endured it, a whispered warning whispered by elders to the young. That winter of 1709 became a legend, not just for its severity, but for the way it forced people to confront the fragility of their existence. It was a season when the world seemed to hold its breath, caught between death and the promise of renewal. And in the stillness of those frozen months, life continued quietly, stubborn and unyielding. If you had lived through it, you might remember the cold as more than a temperature. It was a presence, a force, a story told by frost on windows and the silence of empty fields. A reminder that beneath the warmth of candlelight and hearth, the world outside could be as unforgiving as the darkest dreams. In the months before the winter of 1709, Europe had already been enduring an unusually cold period, what historians now call part of the Little Ice Age, a stretch of centuries where summers were shorter and winters harsher than most would remember. This creeping cold had settled deep into the land and the people, like a quiet companion that none could shake. But what happened that year was unlike anything seen before, a perfect storm of meteorological misfortune and human vulnerability. It is said that the winter arrived early, but it was the cold that refused to leave which marked it as extraordinary. In France, rivers froze to such an extent that markets were held directly on the ice, their wooden stalls creaking beneath the weight of merchants and shoppers alike. This was both a wonder and a warning, a fragile bridge between survival and disaster. The winter of 1709 did not simply chill the bones. It threatened to freeze the very spirit of the people. Villagers relied on old wisdom passed down through generations to face the frost. Fires were tended like precious jewels, hay and straw stuffed into cracks to keep the drafts out, and food was rationed with grim determination. In cities, the poor suffered most severely, their homes ill-equipped to hold warmth, their diets growing thin as supplies dwindled. Letters from the time speak of bread baked too quickly and without yeast, a flat, hard substitute that barely sustained. Yet amidst these hardships, people continued. They walked frozen roads to church, hoping for comfort in prayer. They shared stories and songs, their voices trembling in the cold air but growing stronger with each repetition. The world outside was frozen, but within homes, a fragile warmth endured. Flickering candlelight casting shadows on frost-covered windows, the quiet breathing of those determined to survive another day. The winter of 1709 was not merely a cold season, but a test of human endurance writ large across the continent. Reports tell of families divided by frozen rivers, unable to reunite until thaw returned. Grain stores dwindled, and with them, hope. Livestock, vital to the rural economy, perished in vast numbers, leaving behind not only the cold, but the specter of famine. Markets became ghostly places where only the hardiest dared venture, their breath misting in the frigid air as they bartered what little remained. In some regions, entire villages were cut off, isolated by snowdrifts that reached the eaves of their homes. Communication slowed to a crawl, and rumors swirled of strange happenings: frozen corpses found in the woods, animals behaving oddly, even whispered tales of spirits wandering the frozen landscapes. It was a world transformed into a harsh and silent wilderness, where survival depended not only on skill and preparation, but on luck and willpower. The people who endured this winter often described it as a dream, or rather a nightmare, that stretched on without end. Days blurred into nights, time losing meaning beneath the endless white. Yet in the face of such overwhelming cold, the warmth of human connection became more vibrant. Amidst the biting cold, folk wisdom and superstition thrived. Many believed that the winter's cruelty was the work of unseen forces, witches conjuring the frost to punish the living, or angry spirits rising from the frozen earth. Some homes displayed protective charms, herbs hung above doorways, and prayers were whispered to ward off the creeping cold. In towns and villages, gatherings sometimes turned to desperate rituals, blending faith and fear in a delicate balance. At night, when the wind howled like a restless spirit, the cold seemed to press closer, wrapping itself around every living thing. The flickering candlelight in windows was a small, defiant glow against the vast darkness and the unyielding frost beyond. People spoke quietly of dreams haunted by ice and snow, of restless nights spent listening to the creak of frozen wood and the soft crackle of frost expanding on the glass. Despite the hardship, the human spirit found moments of warmth and joy. Children, cheeks rosy from the cold, made games from the snow. Lovers huddled close beneath heavy cloaks, finding comfort in shared breath and whispered words. In taverns, stories were exchanged like treasured currency, each tale a thread weaving a fragile tapestry of hope. This was a winter that tested more than the body. It tested the heart, the mind, and the bonds that held communities together. It was a season that would be remembered long after the thaw, etched into memory as a time when the world itself seemed to hold its breath beneath a frozen sky. Beyond the immediate hardships, the winter of 1709 left a lasting mark on the collective memory of Europe. Songs and poems emerged, capturing the bitter cold and the resilience it demanded. Some spoke of the ice as a cruel tyrant, others as a harsh teacher, reminding humanity of its fragile place in the natural order. In the years that followed, the memory of that relentless frost shaped how communities prepared for winter, from the stores they kept to the stories they told their children before bed. The bitter cold also revealed the inequalities embedded in society. While the wealthier found ways to shield themselves, thick furs, multiple hearths, and stocked pantries, the poor suffered disproportionately. Many fell ill or starved, their suffering largely unseen beyond their small villages. It was a harsh lesson in vulnerability, one that echoed through generations. Yet, even amid suffering, there were acts of kindness and solidarity. Neighbors shared what little they had. Strangers lent hands to those in need, and communities found strength in unity. The winter of 1709 was not only a story of loss, but one of survival and the stubborn will to endure. Perhaps the cold of that winter, harsh and unyielding, was not just a force of nature, but a mirror held to humanity, reflecting our vulnerabilities, our fears, and our tenacity. It showed how even in the deepest freeze, life could cling to warmth and hope, flickering like a candle in the dark. And as the snows finally melted and the ice retreated, the world began to stir again, slowly, softly, like a dream fading at dawn. The memory of that frozen season remained, whispered in the crackling of fires and the quiet turning of the earth toward spring. What stories might those long, cold nights have inspired? What dreams did the frost shape beneath shuttered windows? And what of us, looking back across centuries, warmed by candlelight, wondering at the strength of those who faced such a winter and survived? As the harsh winter finally gave way to a tentative spring, the landscape of Europe revealed the full toll of the months-long freeze. Rivers swelled with melting ice, flooding low-lying fields and washing away what little crops had survived. The earth itself seemed exhausted, reluctant to awaken from its long slumber. Villagers emerged from their homes, cautious and worn, to survey a world transformed. Yet, even as life struggled to reassert itself, the people began to reckon with the consequences. Grain stores were dangerously low, and the specter of famine loomed large. Markets slowly reopened, but the selection was sparse and prices high. Families who had endured the cold found themselves facing new battles against hunger and disease. The bitter winter had weakened not only bodies, but also the social fabric that bound communities together. Amidst this fragile renewal, stories began to circulate, tales of survival and loss, of miraculous escapes and tragic endings. These accounts were shared around hearths and in town squares, weaving a tapestry of memory and warning. The winter of 1709 had become more than a season. It was a chapter in the ongoing story of human resilience and vulnerability. Spring brought a cautious hope, but nature's recovery was slow and uneven. Fields once fertile remained barren patches of thawed earth and mud. Farmers faced the grim task of planting anew with fewer seeds, and the knowledge that another harsh winter could strike without warning. The cold had not only consumed the past harvest, but also cast a long shadow over the months to come. Communities leaned heavily on traditions and mutual aid. Neighbors shared what little they had, pooling resources and labor to sow the land, in villages and towns alike. This spirit of cooperation became a quiet defiance against the hardship endured. Stories of kindness and endurance flourished amid the whispers of loss. The memory of the frost lingered in every corner. The creaking of ice underfoot, the lingering chill in the air, the slow drip of melting snow. It was a reminder, etched in both landscape and mind, of the fragility of life and the quiet strength needed to face the uncertain future. Alongside the struggle to rebuild, the winter of 1709 spurred changes in how people prepared for future seasons. Practical knowledge, once passed down in whispers and small gatherings, began to take on new urgency. Grain was stored more carefully, homes were better insulated where possible, and the timing of planting and harvesting was reconsidered with caution. In towns, the memory of frost fairs on frozen rivers became part of local folklore, moments of fragile joy amid hardship. These gatherings were celebrations of survival, but also reminders of the delicate balance between nature's gifts and its dangers. People learned to respect the power of winter, recognizing it not merely as a season, but as a force that could reshape lives. Yet, even as communities adapted, the shadow of that bitter winter remained. It lingered in tales told by elders, in songs hummed softly by candlelight, and in the wary eyes of those who remembered how close the world had come to freezing still. Beyond the immediate aftermath, the winter of 1709 echoed through European politics and economies. Crop failures and food shortages strained the coffers of kingdoms and empires. Some regions faced unrest as hunger bred discontent, while rulers grappled with the challenge of maintaining order in a world chilled to its core. The bitter frost revealed fault lines within societies, exposing inequalities and testing the resilience of authority. Yet even amid such tensions, human ingenuity found ways to persevere. Trade routes, though disrupted, slowly reopened. Markets adjusted, and new alliances formed to secure food and fuel. The frost became a catalyst, forcing societies to confront not only nature's cruelty, but also their own vulnerabilities and interdependencies. Through letters, reports, and personal accounts, the winter of 1709 left a rich legacy, one that historians would revisit as a symbol of endurance, adaptation, and the indomitable spirit that carried people through the coldest of times. In the quieter corners of Europe, folk traditions evolved in response to the bitter winter. Songs and tales commemorated the frost's harshness and the courage of those who survived. Some communities held annual remembrances, rituals designed to ward off future cold or honor those lost. These practices blended Christian faith with older pagan customs, offering comfort and a sense of control amid uncertainty. Such rituals were often simple: a shared meal, a lighting of candles, or the telling of stories by the fire. Yet they carried profound meaning, binding communities together and connecting past to present. The winter of 1709 became more than history. It became a living memory, shaping cultural identity and the rhythms of life itself. These physical scars left by the winter slowly healed, but its imprint on the collective consciousness endured. Scholars of the time began to take note of weather patterns and their effects, laying early groundwork for what would centuries later become meteorology. Observations were recorded, linking the severity of the frost to broader climate cycles, though the full understanding remained beyond reach. Meanwhile, artists captured the haunting beauty of frozen landscapes, their works reflecting the eerie stillness and quiet despair of the season. Paintings of snow-covered villages, ice-bound rivers, and bundled figures appeared in homes and courts alike, preserving the memory of a time when the world seemed suspended in a frozen breath. Through these myriad forms, science, art, and story, the winter of 1709 became a touchstone, a reminder of nature's power and humanity's fragile resilience in the face of relentless cold. Even as Europe cautiously emerged from the grip of that relentless winter, the echoes of 1709 shaped the ways communities approached the seasons to come. People learned to read the signs in the skies and soil with renewed attention, watching for subtle changes that might foretell another harsh frost. It was a time of wary hope, where every warm day was cherished, but no one dared to forget the lessons carved into memory by bitter ice and snow. The winter had been a test of endurance, but also a lesson in humility. It reminded all who lived through it that despite human ingenuity and progress, nature's rhythms held sway, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel. And so, wrapped in wool and firelight, communities faced the future with cautious hearts and steady hands, their stories a bridge between the frozen past and the uncertain days ahead. In the aftermath, the social fabric bore subtle but lasting changes. The shared hardship fostered a deeper sense of community in many places, as neighbors leaned on one another to survive. Mutual aid networks, informal yet vital, sprang up in towns and villages alike. People who once might have kept to themselves found strength in collective effort. At the same time, the winter exposed and sometimes widened social divides. Those with resources weathered the storm with less suffering, while the poorest endured the brunt of cold and hunger. This disparity sowed seeds of tension that would later surface in local unrest and demands for change. The frost of 1709 was not only a natural calamity, but a mirror reflecting human inequality. Through these complex dynamics, Europe began to reshape itself, not only physically as the land thawed, but socially and culturally, with the memory of that harsh winter woven into its very fabric. Across the continent, people's relationship with nature deepened in the years following that bitter winter. Farmers began to experiment cautiously with new crops and planting techniques, hoping to reduce the risk of total failure. Folk medicine blended with emerging scientific ideas as healers sought remedies for frostbite, starvation, and illness brought on by the harsh conditions. The frost also inspired stories and legends, many of which endured far beyond the 17th century. Tales of ice spirits, frozen heroes, and miraculous survivals were passed down through generations, becoming part of the cultural tapestry of Europe. These stories offered not only entertainment, but also moral lessons about resilience, respect for nature, and the fragility of life. In this way, the winter of 1709 became more than a historical event. It became a symbol woven into the very identity of the people who lived through it and those who followed. Trade, though disrupted by the freezing months, found ways to adapt. Merchants and travelers discovered new routes, sometimes safer or more reliable in winter's grip. While goods once considered luxury, like spices and warm textiles, became precious lifelines. These changes subtly shifted economic patterns and social interactions across regions. In some cities, the harsh winter spurred innovations in heating and shelter. Inns and homes experimented with better insulation, and firewood became an even more valuable commodity. The long nights and cold days deepened the human need for comfort, shaping architecture and domestic life in subtle but enduring ways. Even as society pushed forward, the shadow of that winter remained, a reminder carved into the very bricks and mortar of towns, as well as the stories whispered by candlelight. Among the scholars and observers of the time, a growing curiosity about climate and weather patterns began to take root. Though the tools were rudimentary, records were kept of temperature, snowfall, and unusual phenomena. This early interest laid groundwork for a future understanding of the cycles that govern the Earth's climate, hinting at the vast forces beyond human control. Meanwhile, the arts continued to reflect the somber beauty of that frozen winter. Poets wrote of ice and silence. Painters captured the fragile light on snowy fields, and musicians composed tunes that echoed the stillness and sorrow of long, cold nights. These cultural expressions preserve the memory of 1709 not only as a historical event, but as an emotional and spiritual experience. Through these intertwined threads, science, art, and human story, the winter of 1709 remained alive in the collective heart of Europe, a frozen chapter of endurance and transformation. Amid these reflections, it is worth considering how the winter of 1709 shaped not only the external world, but the inner lives of those who endured it. The relentless cold and isolation pressed upon minds as much as bodies, fostering a contemplative, sometimes somber mood. Letters from the period reveal moments of quiet despair, but also resilience, a determination to find meaning and hope amid hardship. Some scholars suggest that such harsh experiences deepen human empathy and community bonds. In the candlelit rooms where families gathered against the frost, stories were told not only to pass time, but to forge connections across fear and uncertainty. The winter became a crucible, refining not only survival skills, but the very nature of human relationships. Perhaps this is the true legacy of that frozen season, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest times, warmth can be found in the shared breath and stories of those who faced the storm together. In the years that followed, the winter of 1709 became a touchstone for many communities, a story passed from elders to children as a lesson in endurance and respect for the forces of nature. It shaped calendars, planting cycles, and even superstitions about weather and survival. The frost was not forgotten, but woven into the rhythms of life itself. At the same time, the memory of that winter influenced art, literature, and culture. Painters captured the stark beauty of ice-covered landscapes, poets evoked the silence of snow-laden forests, and storytellers spun tales of heroes who braved the cold. This blending of history and myth ensured the winter of 1709 lived on, a haunting presence just beyond the flicker of candlelight. Through these legacies, the cold season stretched beyond its months, becoming a symbol of human frailty and fortitude intertwined. Though the winter eventually gave way to warmer days, its lessons remained etched deeply into the collective memory. Farmers became more cautious, storing grain more carefully and building shelters designed to withstand future chills. The frost's harsh test prompted innovations in agriculture and architecture, subtle shifts that would ripple through generations. The human stories, too, endured. Tales of families saved by neighbors, of quiet acts of kindness in desperate times, and of survival against odds that seemed insurmountable. These stories were whispered beside fires, shared in markets, and folded into the fabric of community identity. In this way, the winter of 1709 was not only a moment of suffering, but a catalyst for change, a frozen chapter that shaped the future in ways both practical and profound. As decades passed, the winter of 1709 became a benchmark for other harsh seasons. Chroniclers and diarists often compared new winters to that infamous freeze, measuring cold and hardship against a remembered standard. This lasting reference point shaped how people perceived and prepared for the turning of the seasons. Even in art and literature, the legacy endured. The stark imagery of ice and snow, of frozen rivers and bundled figures, continued to inspire works that captured both the beauty and terror of winter's grip. These creative expressions kept the memory alive, passing it down like a whispered warning, or in quieter moments, when the wind no longer howled and the snow had melted into the earth, people found themselves reflecting on what they had endured. The winter of 1709 was not simply a season, but a profound experience that tested every facet of life. It was a reminder of human vulnerability, yes, but also of incredible resilience, the stubborn spark that refuses to be extinguished even in the fiercest cold. Families rebuilt their homes and lives, planting seeds with cautious hope. Communities gathered once more in warm rooms, sharing meals and stories that would carry through generations. The frost had carved its mark into memory, but it had also woven a deeper understanding of connection, endurance, and the cycles of nature. Perhaps then, that frozen winter was not only an ending, but also a beginning, an icy crucible from which new life and new stories emerged, warmed by the flickering light of human spirit. Amidst the slow return of life, the natural world showed signs of resilience as well. Trees, stripped bare by frost, began to bud once more, their branches reaching toward the hesitant sun. Birds returned from their winter shelters, filling the air with cautious song. The thawing rivers carried life back through the land, washing away the silence that had settled like a shroud. But even as the earth revived, the memory of the frozen months lingered. It was a story told in the creak of old wood, the flicker of candlelight, and the careful tending of hearth fires. A story of survival written not only in books and paintings, but in the very rhythms of daily life. And so, as the seasons turned, the people of Europe carried with them the echoes of that winter, a whisper of cold etched into the warmth of their homes, a reminder of the strength found in enduring the longest nights. Even as life returned to the land, the winter of 1709 remained a potent symbol of nature's power and humanity's fragility. It shaped not only the practical, but also the spiritual lives of those who survived. Faith and superstition intertwined, offering comfort against the unpredictable forces beyond human control. Communities held ceremonies to honor the endurance of their people, rituals blending hope and remembrance. Candles were lit in windows to guide the lost, prayers whispered for warmer days, and stories told to keep the frost at bay. These traditions became part of the fabric of daily life, carried forward through generations as a testament to resilience. In this way, the bitter cold of 1709 was not just endured, it was transformed into a source of strength, a shared memory warming hearts even in the coldest winters to come. The memory of the winter of 1709 also found its way into the arts and letters of the time. Poets penned verses that spoke of silent fields and frozen rivers, capturing both the beauty and the desolation of those long months. Painters rendered scenes of icebound villages, their palettes muted but rich with the emotions of endurance and loss. Music, too, reflected the somber mood, with compositions echoing the slow, deliberate pace of winter's grip. These creative expressions served not only as records, but as emotional responses, channels through which people processed the trauma and found meaning in survival. Through these cultural legacies, the winter became more than a historical event. It became a living story retold by generations who found in it both warning and wisdom. As memories of the winter settled deeper into collective consciousness, practical changes began to emerge alongside cultural ones. Villagers and townsfolk reconsidered how they stored food, fortified their homes, and planned their lives around the unpredictability of weather. Lessons learned in hardship turned into cautious preparation, a quiet resilience woven into daily routines. Some communities began to record weather patterns with greater care, marking the passage of seasons and noting signs of impending cold. Though science was still in its infancy, these early observations sowed seeds for future understanding of climate and environment. In this blend of practical wisdom and cultural memory, the legacy of the winter of 1709 endured, shaping the rhythms of life and the stories told by candlelight. Yet, despite all the preparations and adaptations, nature's whims remained unpredictable. Later winters could be harsh, though none matched the relentless grip of 1709. These seasons, marked by cold and scarcity, served as reminders of the fragile balance between human endeavor and the forces beyond control. Still, the memory of that infamous winter continued to inspire caution and respect. Tales of frozen rivers and frostbitten fields were recounted alongside prayers for mercy and hope for spring's return. In this way, the bitter cold remained alive in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it, a silent teacher through generations. And so, life went on, shaped in part by the frozen breath of a winter long past, but never truly forgotten. Amidst this ongoing dance with nature, people found ways to celebrate the changing seasons. Festivals marking the end of winter and the arrival of spring gained new significance. Bonfires burned brighter, songs were sung louder, and dances lasted longer, each act a joyful defiance against the memory of cold and darkness. These communal celebrations fostered hope and renewal, weaving together the threads of past hardship with the promise of warmer days. They reminded all who took part that even after the harshest winters, life returned, resilient, vibrant, and full of possibility. Through such rituals, the story of the winter of 1709 was not only remembered, but transformed, becoming a beacon of endurance and the enduring warmth of human spirit. In quieter moments, reflection turned to gratitude for the simple gifts of warmth and light. The flicker of a candle, the crackle of a hearth fire, and the gentle touch of a loved one's hand took on deeper meaning. These small comforts were the balm against the long shadow of frost and hardship. Communities learned to cherish these moments of peace, weaving them into their daily lives and stories. The winter of 1709 had been a trial, yes, but it also illuminated the quiet strengths that sustain us: hope, connection, and the enduring flicker of human warmth amidst the cold. And so, beneath the soft glow of candlelight, the memory of that frozen winter lived on, not just as a tale of survival, but as a lullaby for restless souls seeking comfort in the long, dark nights. Even as the years passed and the winter of 1709 receded into history, its lessons lingered in the hearts and homes of those who remembered. It was a time that tested the limits of endurance, but also revealed the depths of human compassion and resilience. Stories passed from one generation to the next, whispered beside flickering fires, reminding listeners of the harshness of nature and the warmth found in community. These tales became part of the fabric of life, shaping how people understood their place in a world both beautiful and unforgiving. In this quiet way, the frost of 1709 remained alive, an eternal ember glowing softly in the candlelit historian's tale. And so, as the cycle of seasons continued, the memory of the winter of 1709 settled into a place of both reverence and caution. It became a marker in time, a story told to remind all who would listen of nature's unpredictable power and the strength required to face it. Through hardship and survival, the people of Europe learned to weave resilience into the very fabric of their lives. Fires were kept burning a little longer, doors were bolted a little tighter, and candles flickered softly against the long nights. This winter, harsh and unyielding, remained a silent teacher, its lessons etched in ice and memory, carried forward by those who lived to tell the tale. In the heart of early 18th century Europe, life found a fragile rhythm once again. The winter of 1709 had left its mark, but communities were rebuilding, hope flickering like candlelight through darkened rooms. Towns thrummed with renewed activity, markets reopened, children's laughter returned to the streets, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the fresh promise of spring. It was a time of resilience and quiet determination. Daily life unfolded with familiar rituals: the rising sun coaxing farmers to their fields, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, and the soft murmur of voices sharing news and gossip by firesides. Yet beneath this calm surface lingered the memory of a season that had tested the very limits of endurance. Homes were warmer now, often filled with the comforting sense of herbs and baked bread. The fashion of the day reflected both practicality and the desire to reclaim joy. Soft woolen cloaks and sturdy leather boots replaced the. As spring matured into summer, the countryside blossomed with life. Fields of wheat and barley swayed gently in the breeze, orchards burst with fruit, and rivers sparkled under golden sunlight. Yet even in this vibrant season, whispers of the past winter's severity remained, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones to children and travelers alike. Among the townsfolk, stories of survival became legend, woven into songs and plays performed in market squares. These narratives celebrated the endurance of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, and craftsfolk who had weathered hardship with courage and community spirit. Their lives, though simple, were rich with rituals that connected them to the land and to each other. In this golden age of recovery, The bond between humanity and nature was both tender and tentative. People cherished the warmth of the sun, but remained ever mindful of winter's harsh lessons, carrying its memory like a protective talisman against the unknown. Evenings in this period carried their own quiet enchantment. After the day's work, towns transformed into pockets of gentle light, each home glowing faintly through shutters. The low hum of conversation drifted through the air. Fathers speaking in low voices over mugs of ale, mothers mending clothes by the hearth, children dozing to the crackle of burning logs. In larger towns, candlelit taverns became gathering spots where merchants exchanged news from distant cities. Some spoke of political shifts and royal intrigues, but most were content to trade stories of weather patterns, crop yields, and the fortunes of neighbors. It was a time when even mundane events, an early apple harvest, a newly repaired bridge, were causes for communal pride. Artisans thrived once more, their trades revitalized by a renewed sense of demand and possibility. The rhythmic clink of a blacksmith's hammer, or the scent of freshly planed oak from a carpenter's shop, signaled prosperity's return. These trades were more than mere work. They were the lifeblood of towns, each creation a piece of shared identity. Summer fairs began to flourish again. Bright banners waved in the breeze. Music from fiddles and flutes danced across the air. And tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, cheeses, and fresh bread. Farmers brought their finest produce, eager to display not just abundance, but recovery, a silent statement that hardship had not claimed them entirely. Even nature seemed to join in the celebration. Meadows bloomed with wildflowers, bees hummed in lazy spirals above clover, and the scent of lavender and hay perfumed the air. Birds, absent for much of the brutal winter, returned in flocks that filled the sky with their restless, darting movements. Yet for all this vibrancy, there was an undercurrent of watchfulness. People knew that seasons could turn treacherous without warning. They tended their stores more carefully now, salted meats with precision, and preserved fruits in glass jars against the possibility of leaner days. It was as though the memory of scarcity had etched itself into the communal mind, shaping both caution and gratitude. Markets in this era became not just places of trade, but stages of social theater. Stalls overflowed with polished apples, jars of amber honey, coils of sausage, and bolts of dyed cloth, so vivid they seemed to capture fragments of the summer sky. Hawkers called out in warm, lilting tones, competing in charm as much as in price. Bargaining was rarely sharp or bitter now. There was a shared understanding that every coin passed from hand to hand was another thread in the fabric of the town's revival. Children, once kept close during the harder years, now roamed more freely. They played in alleys and by the riverbank, building makeshift boats from scraps of wood and reeds. Laughter carried easily over the hum of daily life, and their games often mimicked the work of their elders, prepend markets, miniature carpentry, or shadow duels with wooden swords. It was a generation that had seen the tail end of hardship, but would remember these years as the bright turning point. Festive gatherings, once sporadic luxuries, became regular markers of the calendar. The midsummer feast was perhaps the most beloved. Tables laid end to end down the main street, where neighbors brought their best dishes, and no one kept count of who gave more or less. Lanterns swung from ropes above the street, casting a warm, honey-colored glow as music filled the air. Couples danced barefoot, elders clapped along, and even the shyest souls found themselves drawn into the rhythm before the night was done. Craftsmanship itself reached a kind of renaissance. Bakers experimented with sweeter breads now that honey and fruit were plentiful again. Potters painted brighter glazes, no longer rationing pigments. Even the simplest household items, spoons, bowls, door latches, were shaped with care and a certain quiet pride. Possessions carried stories, and people valued them less for their price than for the hands that had shaped them. Beyond the towns, the countryside too basked in a rare harmony. Fields, well-tended and fertile, yield crops in orderly abundance. Shepherds guided flocks across rolling meadows where the grass seemed to ripple like green silk. Streams ran clear and cold, and fishing became not just a means of survival, but a leisurely pastime for those with the time to spare. Travelers passing through often remarked on the balance of human and nature here. Villages nestled into valleys without disturbing the slopes, cottages framed by orchards rather than walls. The Golden Age was not one of opulence or grandeur, but of sufficiency, of a deep, abiding contentment. People worked hard, yes, but their labor was rewarded, and the days unfolded with a steady rhythm that left space for joy. Each morning, shutters were opened to greet the sunlight without dread of what the day might demand. Each evening, doors closed against the night with the knowledge that for now, all was well. The hour had slipped past midnight, yet Venice's heart beat on in a slow, steady rhythm, as if the city itself had learned the art of breathing in measured, silent intervals. From the Rialto to the shadowed edges of Cannaregio, each district seemed to hum with its own muted life. Lanterns swayed gently above narrow alleys, their light touching damp walls with a golden sheen, so that the very stones appeared warm despite the chill of the lagoon air. The canals were mirrors again, unbroken save for the faint curl of a gondolier's oar, each stroke so deliberate it might have been choreographed centuries before. It was the kind of night in which nothing seemed accidental, as if the whole of Venice had conspired to present itself in its most perfect, unchanging form. From a window high above a side canal, a woman leaned out to shake the folds of a silk shawl before bringing it close to her cheek, testing its softness in the lamplight. Somewhere nearby, two young men stood shoulder to shoulder on a bridge, their quiet conversation carried along the water, punctuated by laughter low enough not to disturb the hour. Down the alley, a baker, one of the few tradesmen who kept such late hours, pulled warm loaves from his oven, their crusts crackling faintly as they met the cool air. The scent drifted outward and upward, twining with the perfume of crushed herbs tossed into the canal by someone superstitious enough to ward off bad luck. There was music, too, not the bright, brassy call of carnival bands, but something thinner, almost secretive. A lone violinist played under a stone archway, bow moving with unhurried precision. His case lay open at his feet, but no one tossed in coins. In this hour, the music was not a service, but a gift, a ribbon tied around the night, meant for anyone who happened to pass. He played not to be heard, but simply to keep the melody alive until the dawn pressed it into silence. By the mid-1700s, the city's prosperity reached an almost theatrical peak. It was no longer simply a hub for survival in the far north. It had become a stage upon which wealth, vanity, and politics performed in perfect harmony. The great markets of the frost-lined central square bustled in every season, but it was in winter, when the snow fell in vast glittering sheets, that they truly came alive. Fur traders from distant tundras displayed pelts so thick they looked carved from clouds. Glassmakers sold delicate, translucent goblets that seemed to hold the frozen breath of the air itself. Nobles and merchants wove between the stalls in cloaks embroidered with threads of gold, their boots crunching over icy cobblestones. For outsiders, the city appeared a contradiction. How could such a remote, frozen place be so vibrant? The answer was ambition. Every craft, every alliance, every feast was calculated not only for pleasure, but for status. The wealthy funded expeditions into the deep wilds, searching for rarer stones, rarer metals, rarer furs, anything that could reinforce their position in this icy hierarchy. Music was never absent. Strings and flutes played in heated halls where the air shimmered with warmth. Dancers swirled in gowns of thick velvet, the hem brushing over patterned rugs imported from warmer kingdoms. The city's rulers hosted masked balls where faces were hidden, but intentions were rarely secret. Alliances were forged in whispered words behind feathered masks, betrayals plotted with a polite smile and a clink of wine cups. And yet, beneath all this splendor, there was a shared understanding. Winter was not just a backdrop. It was a ruler in its own right, one no council could overrule. Every citizen knew the frost could take away as quickly as it had given. The frozen city's golden age existed in a fragile balance, suspended like a snowflake midair. The frozen river, which in warmer lands would be nothing more than a ribbon of water, served here as both road and stage. When the winter freeze came, which it always did without fail, the ice became a gleaming thoroughfare lined with lanterns. Sleighs trimmed in fox fur glided over its surface, carrying merchants, nobles, and messengers as swiftly as the wind could carry them. On festival nights, the river transformed into a shimmering avenue of firelight, torches planted in the snow to guide the way for late-night revelers. Taverns along the banks thrived on such nights, their windows fogged with warmth, their doors spilling music and the scent of spiced mead into the cold air. Inside, the laughter was loud, the wagers reckless, and the talk, well, the talk was never idle. In the frozen city, words had weight, and one overheard sentence could make or unmake fortunes. The city's artisans had grown bold. Jewelers carved ice into temporary sculptures that glowed from within, using colored glass and hidden candles. These works would melt away within days, but that was part of their allure. Beauty here was a fleeting thing, and the citizens adored it all the more for that. The rulers encouraged this atmosphere of spectacle. Public banquets were held beneath heated pavilions, with tables groaning under salted meats, smoked fish, and imported wines kept cold by the very air. On these occasions, the city seemed untouchable, a jewel in the snow, glittering in defiance of the cold. But there were always those who noticed the cracks first. A missed shipment of grain from the south, a sudden disappearance of a wealthy fur merchant, rumors of unrest among the workers who toiled in the freezing ore mines beyond the city walls. These whispers were easy to dismiss amid the glow of lanterns and music, but they lingered, like the first chill of an oncoming storm. It began with the wolves. At first, their appearance on the outskirts of the city was little more than a curiosity. Hunters returning from the forests spoke of larger packs, of eyes watching from the tree line even in daylight. Wolves had always been part of life here, but never so bold, never so close. The city's guards dismissed it as a harsh winter driving the beasts toward easier prey. But then a sleigh vanished on the north road. No tracks left behind, but a sprawl of blood and torn cloth frozen into the snow. Shortly after, the ice market saw its first shortages. Grain that had been promised by southern traders did not arrive. Barges bound upriver were delayed, their sails frozen to their masts by unexpected storms. Prices climbed. The wealthy bought in bulk, storing goods in deep, cold cellars. The poor began stretching thin broth over too many mouths. The rulers tried to mask the unease with spectacle. An elaborate winter masque was declared, with costumes so ornate they were said to rival the frozen sculptures themselves. The nobles waltzed beneath chandeliers of ice, while, just beyond the lamplit streets, the sound of howling carried over the walls. Merchants whispered of something stranger. that the wolves were not the only ones watching the city. Travelers from the mining settlements told of figures in heavy cloaks standing at the forest's edge, unmoving, as if waiting. The first thaw would not come for months. By then, the city's glittering heart would have to face the truth. The ice was beginning to crack, and it wasn't just the rivers. The frost that had once brought quiet beauty now became a merciless adversary. Streets that had glittered beneath lantern light turned treacherous. Ice cracked beneath the weight of carts, spilling goods into frozen canals. Homes that had seemed fortified against winter now trembled under the constant freeze. Shutters warped, roofs sagged with snow. Food grew scarce. The grain brought from the south rotted on arrival, frozen in tightly packed sacks, while livestock weakened from hunger and cold. Those who had once wandered the ice canals for leisure now did so only to forage, gathering scraps from the outskirts, while wolves prowled closer with each passing night. In the city squares, panic whispered beneath the masked festivities. Nobles hid behind heavy doors, their jewels meaningless against starvation, their feasts reduced to scraps. The ordinary citizens, long accustomed to harsh winters, found themselves stretched beyond endurance. Fires dwindled. Smoke rose thinly from chimneys, carrying the scent of desperation into the bitter air. Stories of loss traveled fast, carried by the few travelers brave enough to cross frozen bridges or venture along the treacherous roads. Families were separated as the poor fled to abandoned villages, only to find homes stripped of provisions. The ice that had once mirrored lanterns now mirrored fear, the reflection of a city trapped in its own frozen splendor. Even the arts suffered. Musicians could not find audiences. Sculptors lacked materials, and the painted halls of nobles were silent. The city's pulse slowed to a fragile beat, measured not in celebration but in survival. Every gesture, every movement became a negotiation with the cold. Yet amid the struggle, the human spirit lingered. Families huddled together, sharing what warmth remained. Stories, whispered, recited, murmured, became the hearth for hearts too cold for fire. Candlelight, though scarce, remained a talisman against the creeping despair. The frozen city, in its golden age, had seemed eternal, but now the ice taught its final lesson. Beauty and prosperity were fleeting, fragile against the relentless march of nature. The city that had gleamed so brightly under lanterns and laughter now wore a quieter, heavier face. Winter's grip tightened, and the streets, once full of music and chatter, grew empty and still. Snow drifted in thick, silent curtains, muffling every footstep. Even the canals, mirrors of gold and firelight not long ago, were dulled beneath layers of ice, their surfaces opaque and unyielding. Merchants closed their stalls earlier each day, wary of the frost that had begun to bite through boots and cloaks alike. Hearths were kept burning longer, yet warmth seemed to vanish before it could settle into the bones. Windows frosted over in intricate, cruel patterns, delicate enough to admire, but harsh enough to remind every viewer of the cold beyond. The river, once a playground of gliding sleighs and festive floats, became a trap for the unwary. Ice that looked solid betrayed the unprepared traveler. A single misstep could send a foot through its surface into freezing water below. And as the wind howled through empty streets, carrying voices and distant bells far across the city, there was a sense that the frozen world itself was watching, waiting for a misstep, a lapse in attention. As days passed, scarcity began to press upon the city in ways that no festival or light could mask. Grain stores dwindled, the precious reserves hoarded by merchants and nobles more out of fear than greed. Bread, once soft and warm, hardened within hours of baking. Casks of wine grew thick with frost, their contents sluggish, while oil congealed in lamps, leaving rooms dimmer and chillier than ever. Even the simplest tasks demanded more effort. Wells froze solid, forcing families to spend hours hacking ice just to draw a single bucket of water. Wood, already scarce, burned quickly, leaving homes shivering despite the flames. Streets, empty of revelers, became gauntlet paths where frost bit through gloves and fur, testing endurance at every step. And yet, life did not stop entirely. Some still ventured to the markets, though fewer than before, bringing only what was necessary. Children, their games smaller and quieter, found ways to amuse themselves in alleyways, their laughter fleeting but precious. Families clung to routines that reminded them of stability, however fragile, preserving what comfort they could from the relentless cold. The wind carried more than chill. It brought whispers of fear. Travelers spoke of wolves prowling closer to the city's edges, their eyes gleaming in the pale light. Hunters reported that deer and smaller animals grew scarce, having fled or succumbed to the cold. In towns, even domesticated creatures suffered. Chickens froze in coops, cattle huddled miserably in yards too small to shield them from the bite of frost. Rumors spread quickly in such quiet streets. People spoke of families disappearing overnight, of stores emptied before the next dawn, of frost claiming more than water and wood, claiming hope itself. The wealthy could retreat into inner chambers, but even there, warmth was fleeting. Candles guttered in the draft, smoke hung low, and food became rationed to the bare minimum. Still, some stubborn human warmth persisted. Neighbors shared scraps, whispered stories, and stoked fires in collective hope. In certain districts, musicians played under doorways for coins or kindness, their notes cutting through the dense, frozen silence. It was a world in which survival had become ritual, every act deliberate, every movement measured against the ice-laden air. By midwinter, even the bravest citizens felt the weight of relentless cold pressing upon every aspect of life. Fires burned low in homes, smoke rising thinly into the bitter air. Streets were littered with abandoned carts, half-frozen bundles of goods left behind by those who had fled or simply could not manage the effort. Markets shrank further. Only essentials were traded, and even then, quantities were minimal, measured carefully to stretch through the long nights. Hunger became a quiet companion in many households. Bread, once plentiful, was rationed. Potatoes and dried fruits were hoarded. Any sudden misstep in calculation could mean a family went without for a day or two. Livestock, precious for both meat and milk, were culled early, a grim decision made to save resources for the living. Snow buried the less fortunate quickly, and some stories tell of those found frozen in doorways or alleys, clutching what warmth or possessions they could. Even the city's canals, lifeblood and thoroughfare, betrayed their residents. Ice, at first firm and bright, developed hidden cracks. Sleighs and carts broke through, carrying goods and sometimes lives into frigid waters beneath. Gondoliers, once skilled and confident, now moved with fear, testing each step on uncertain ice before committing their full weight. And all around, the sound of wind carried warnings that no one could fully ignore. A low, mournful whistle through alleys, a distant cracking of frozen timber, the faint but undeniable groan of ice under weight. By late winter, the frozen city's elegance had all but vanished beneath the weight of survival. Wealth and status mattered little when every hearth struggled to stay alive, and every mouth had to be fed from dwindling stores. Streets that once echoed with laughter were now lined with the silent shuffle of weary travelers, carrying bundles of what little they could spare. Children huddled close to parents, their small faces pale, eyes wide with both fear and wonder. at the endless white that pressed in from every side. The city's population grew quiet with exhaustion, each day a careful negotiation between movement and stillness. Simple acts, fetching water, chopping firewood, carrying provisions, became prolonged, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Even the bravest merchants now hesitated to leave their homes, their routines reduced to the barest necessity. Those who ventured into the streets did so with a rigid caution, aware that the slightest misjudgment could have immediate and irreversible consequences. Even familiar sights took on a sinister edge. The lanterns that had once glimmered like jewels in alleyways now cast long, quivering shadows that twisted across walls and icy pavements. Windows frosted over from the inside, trapping the warmth of a room, but showing only opaque silhouettes to the outside world. The river, once a glittering avenue for sleighs and gondolas, now appeared as a solid, unbroken expanse of peril. A wrong step could plunge one into icy waters with no hope of immediate rescue. Yet, even as despair crept through the streets, pockets of quiet resilience persisted. Families huddled together in their dimly lit homes, sharing warmth from the same blanket, from the same fire. In narrow alleys, neighbors exchanged small gifts of bread or scraps of smoked meat, gestures almost ritualistic in their careful precision. Candlelight flickered in windows, not for spectacle, but for survival, a signal to the lonely that someone still lingered, still endured. Stories became as vital as food. Elders recited tales of winters past, of ancestors who had survived even harsher storms, their voices low and soothing, meant to both distract and fortify. Children, while wary of the cold outside, listened intently, eyes wide as the flames painted dancing shapes on the walls. Even the faint sound of a song, a violin played in a doorway, a soft hum from a window, could lift the weight of hours spent in frozen silence. Tradesmen adapted quietly. Bakers rose hours before dawn, coaxing warmth from ovens to keep their families fed, and streets slightly less barren. Blacksmiths stoked their forges, hammering tools that would be used to split firewood or mend carts, the rhythmic clang a reminder that work, however modest, continued. In these moments, the city's pulse, though slowed, was not entirely extinguished. Survival had reshaped life into a delicate balance, a pattern of small victories and careful routines. And amid the cold, the snow, and the quiet terror of winter, people discovered a different kind of warmth, one drawn from human connection, from perseverance, from the simple act of enduring together. The cold seemed to deepen with each passing night, no longer merely a challenge, but a presence pressing against every wall, every shutter, every heart. Rivers of ice, once playful and mirrored with lanterns, became dangerous corridors. Sleighs and carts broke through hidden cracks, goods lost, and occasionally, a life claimed by the frozen waters below. Hunger gnawed at homes where fire barely kept warmth in check. Families rationed whatever remained, a thin broth, a single loaf shared among several mouths. Livestock, already diminished, now fell to frostbite or starvation. Some desperate souls ventured farther than they should, risking frozen bridges or untested alleys for what little could be found. The streets, once lively, now echoed with muffled sobs and cautious footsteps. Whispers of illness traveled as swiftly as the wind, and fear clung to the city like frost on every shutter. Even the wealthiest felt the tightening grip of nature, for no coin could summon warmth where wood was scarce and ice relentless. Yet the human spirit, though strained, persisted. Small acts, sharing a scrap of bread, lending a blanket, whispering a comforting word, became sacred. In homes lit by flickering candles, families huddled close, telling stories, humming songs, and preserving what life and hope they could. In these fragile, fleeting comforts, the city endured, awaiting the slow return of light and warmth that would eventually bring the frozen world to life once more. By the end of winter, the frozen city had changed in ways visible and unseen. Streets that had once glimmered now lay muted beneath thick snow and ice. Buildings, though intact, bore the marks of frost's slow assault, warped shutters, sagging roofs, and cracked chimneys. The laughter that had filled halls and alleys was replaced by the quiet shuffling of those who survived, their faces pale but resolute. Even in the hardest days, however, life persisted. Fires still burned, though low. Candles flickered in windows, a small defiance against the cold. Families held together. Neighbors shared what they could, and stories, whispered, sung, or recited, wove a fragile tapestry of hope across the frozen landscape. The city had been tested, and though many scars remained, it endured. And as the first hints of thaw brushed the edges of rooftops and the ice on the rivers softened into slow-running water, a delicate promise lingered in the air. The cycle of seasons would continue, and with it, the rhythms of life, resilience, and renewal. Though winter had pressed heavily upon the city, it had also revealed the subtle warmth of human perseverance, the quiet bonds that made survival not just possible, but profoundly meaningful. The ice and snow showed no mercy, and the city's inhabitants adapted as best they could. Roofs groaned under heavy blankets of frost, and people moved carefully along narrow streets, boots crunching against hardened snow. Families took turns keeping fires stoked through the long nights, each flame a fragile shield against the relentless cold. Water, the most precious resource, demanded endless labor. Buckets frozen solid were chipped away piece by piece, wood split for the effort, and yet the supply barely met the needs of those who had remained. People whispered of neighbors succumbing to frostbite or exhaustion, their absence marked only by empty doorways and quiet alleys. Even in these harsh conditions, small moments of warmth persisted. Children shared thin blankets, mothers offered morsels of bread, and old stories were told again by candlelight, their words carrying comfort as if the past itself could shield against the frozen present. The city's pulse, though diminished, persisted in these fragile threads of care, weaving a quiet, stubborn endurance into every home and alleyway. Snow piled higher with each passing day, draping the city in a muffled silence. Streets became narrow tunnels of white, where even the bravest dared only slow, measured steps. Travel between districts grew treacherous, and the few who ventured out did so with heavy cloaks and cautious eyes, aware that a single slip could prove fatal. Hunger gnawed steadily at households. Fires burned low. Food ran thin, and families rationed every morsel. Livestock that survived the initial frost now weakened further, their breath misting in cold barns as they pressed together for warmth. Even simple chores like fetching water or splitting wood became exercises in endurance, each act draining yet necessary for survival. Still, small sparks of humanity endured. Neighbors helped one another carry bundles of wood, shared scraps of food, and offered words of comfort. Children, though pale and quiet, still found ways to amuse themselves with whispered games, while elders recited tales that stitched a thread of continuity through the frozen months. In these fragile gestures, the city clung to its heartbeat, faint but unwavering, a testament to perseverance against the merciless frost. By the deepest stretch of winter, the city seemed caught in a frozen stillness that weighed on every soul. Even the strongest walls offered little comfort as frost crept through cracks, wrapping homes in icy fingers. Water, food, and firewood were treasured above all else, rationed carefully, and yet never quite enough. The cold became almost a living presence, pressing in from the streets, through shutters, beneath doors. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets, bodies, and whispered words to keep fear at bay. Travelers and merchants, once confident, now moved cautiously, wary of hidden ice, sudden snowdrifts, and the ever-present threat of injury or worse. Animals mirrored the human struggle. Horses shivered in stalls, cattle huddled close together, and wolves prowled nearer the city than ever before. Even birds fell silent, wings stiff with frost, while small creatures burrowed and vanished beneath deep snow. In these relentless conditions, every breath, every movement, every shared scrap of warmth became a quiet act of defiance, a testament to the stubborn persistence of life amid the frozen world. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the city felt the faint stirrings of change. Snow softened along the edges of streets, revealing worn cobblestones beneath. Ice on the river cracked in thin, cautious lines, letting through small trickles of water that glittered like silver in the pale sun. Though the cold remained, its hold seemed less absolute. Families emerged cautiously from homes, brushing snow from doorways, testing paths once abandoned. Children ventured farther than before, their laughter light and tentative, carrying across streets that had long been silent. Even small victories in warmth became more meaningful. Fires burned steadier, ovens coaxed bread to rise more fully, and neighbors shared not just survival necessities, but small comforts: a warm drink, a kindly word, a shared smile. In these delicate shifts, the frozen city began to reclaim a rhythm, fragile but persistent, a heartbeat returning after months of icy suspension. Even as the first hints of spring crept into the city, the scars of winter remained visible everywhere. Streets were rutted and slushy, snowbanks littered with debris from abandoned carts, and rooftops still bore patches of frost that had stubbornly clung through the nights. Windows glimmered with droplets of melting ice, reflecting flickers of candlelight inside homes, a subtle reminder that warmth and light were slowly returning. People moved with cautious hope. Merchants opened their stalls again, arranging goods that had survived the frost. Children ventured farther into the streets, though each step was measured, testing the weakened ice that still covered shallow canals. Families gathered near the first open wells, drawing water in careful increments, savoring the labor as a small triumph. In homes, fires burned steadily once more, a comfort long denied. The rhythm of daily life began to return, though every movement carried memory of the harsh months just past. Candles flickered in windows not only for warmth, but as signals, reminders that the city had endured, that its people had survived the relentless frost, and that even in the darkest winters, life could persist. With the thaw progressing, subtle signs of life returned to every corner. Trees, bare and brittle during the frost, began to glisten with droplets of melting ice, the promise of new growth lingering in each branch. Puddles formed along cobblestones, reflecting the pale sunlight, and the faint sound of running water hinted at rivers and wells slowly regaining their rhythm. People ventured further each day, testing streets, canals, and bridges that had been treacherous only days before. The rhythm of work, long slowed by the relentless winter, began to reassert itself. Bakers baked larger batches, merchants rearranged shelves and stalls, and families allowed themselves small celebrations, a shared sense of relief that the worst of the frozen months was behind them. Even the smallest gestures carried profound weight. A neighbor offering a warm cup of broth, a child sharing a found scrap of bread, the laughter of friends echoing through alleys long silent. These simple acts were both defiance and gratitude, affirming the persistence of life. The city, though battered and weary, began to breathe again, each careful step a movement toward warmth, comfort, and the return of ordinary days. even as the ice receded and streets became passable. The memory of winter lingered in every corner. Walls retained a damp chill, roofs bore the marks of heavy snow, and the air smelled faintly of melted frost, sharp and metallic. People moved with a mix of relief and caution, aware that nature's hand could return just as suddenly as it had struck. Daily routines resumed, though tempered by the lessons learned. Families tended gardens and livestock with care. Rationed provisions were replenished slowly, and neighbors spoke quietly of the months past, sharing stories of survival and small triumphs. The rhythm of city life, once frozen and slowed, returned with deliberate steps, each movement measured, each act purposeful. Even the festivals, long postponed, began to flicker back into life. Lanterns swung in alleyways, markets buzzed with cautious energy, and the laughter of children became a balm for those who had endured the longest nights. The frozen city, scarred but unbroken, carried in its streets, homes, and hearts the quiet testimony of human endurance, a reminder that even the harshest winters eventually soften under the persistent warmth of life. By the time spring edged fully into the city, the frozen city had been forever changed. The snow and ice that had dominated months of life left behind a transformed landscape, streets reshaped by melting runoff, rooftops still bearing faint traces of frost, and rivers slow to reclaim their fluid motion. Yet, amidst this altered world, the subtle triumph of endurance shone through. Families, neighbors, and merchants alike moved with renewed purpose, their steps lighter, their voices carrying warmth and relief. Candles burned steadily in windows, signaling both survival and the shared knowledge that the worst had passed. Even the smallest acts, sharing food, tending a garden, offering comfort, were amplified in significance, proof that humanity persisted even when nature pressed most harshly. In these final moments of reflection, the city itself seemed to exhale. The winter that had frozen it solid, tested it, and humbled its inhabitants now faded into memory. Yet, the lessons remained: the fragility of life, the quiet power of perseverance, and the delicate, enduring warmth found in human connection. And as the first gentle breezes of spring stirred the streets and rooftops, the city, scarred, resilient, and alive, waited patiently for the rhythm of life to fully return, a heartbeat restored after months of icy stillness. Perhaps you have wondered, in the quiet of your own hearth, what it might have been like to live through such a winter. To wake each morning to frost that pressed against every shutter, to move through streets muffled in snow, to measure every breath against the icy air that threatened to steal it. Yet even in the harshest moments, life found a rhythm, fragile, deliberate, and luminous in its persistence. The city, once frozen and silent, now exhaled slowly into the gentle embrace of spring. Puddles reflected the soft light of early sun. Ice on rooftops glimmered like glass for a few brief hours, and the faint murmur of running water whispered through alleys long quiet. Children ventured farther, their laughter tentative yet undeniable, a soft ripple of life through streets scarred but alive. Families gathered near rekindled fires, sharing warmth and whispered stories, recounting small victories and the quiet courage of neighbors. Even the most mundane moments, a loaf baked, water drawn from a newly thawed well, a blanket shared, became luminous in memory, proof of endurance and human connection. And as night fell, the city settled once more. Candlelight flickered in windows, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the air carried the lingering scent of wood and melted frost. In this gentle twilight, one might imagine the lessons of winter pressing softly upon the mind, that even the coldest, harshest months eventually yield, and that warmth, human, subtle, enduring, can survive any frost. Perhaps, as you listen now, the story of the frozen city becomes not just history, but a lullaby. A reminder that even in the face of relentless winter, life, connection, and gentle persistence endure. And as your own eyes grow heavy, the quiet streets, the softened ice, and the tender warmth of those who lived through the cold may carry you into a gentle sleep, where frost and snow exist only as a whisper in memory, and the city rests, alive and eternal, beneath the soft, forgiving light of spring. Perhaps you imagine the quiet streets at dawn, the world still wrapped in the soft hush of melted frost. The first rays of sunlight touch the rooftops and cobblestones, glinting off puddles like tiny lanterns scattered across the city. Birds, once silent in the depths of winter, now begin their gentle songs, careful and tentative, as if remembering the cold that pressed so harshly upon their wings. Inside the homes, families move with careful ease, the rhythm of daily life returning slowly, but with a calm certainty. Bread is kneaded with tender hands, fires stoked with careful patience, and the simple act of drawing water from wells becomes a quiet ritual, a moment to honor survival and the return of warmth. Even the smallest details, the scent of fresh dough, the curl of smoke from a chimney, the warmth seeping from a shared blanket, carry profound meaning, reminders that life persists in the gentlest, most subtle ways. And perhaps you feel, as you listen, the echo of winter's lessons lingering softly. The cold that once seemed endless taught patience, the fragility of comfort, and the enduring strength found in simple acts of care. The city, scarred but resilient, carries these whispers of memory in every street, every home, every soft ripple of water in the slowly thawing canals. Perhaps, in the soft twilight, you might imagine walking through the streets yourself. Each step is careful, not from fear, but from the reverence of what has passed. Snowbanks, though diminished, still frame alleys and courtyards, remnants of a winter that once seemed eternal. The air carries the faint scent of wood smoke, mingled with the freshness of thawing earth, a gentle perfume that speaks of endings and beginnings alike. You might notice the subtle movements of people around you, a mother adjusting a blanket on her child, a baker tending the last embers in his oven, an old man pausing to trace patterns in the frost that still lingers on a window pane. These small, ordinary acts take on a quiet beauty in the context of what has been endured. Life, in all its fragile complexity, persists, and in this persistence, there is comfort, warmth, and a soft, lingering wonder. And so, as you close your eyes and listen to the echo of the frozen city, imagine the gentle return of light and warmth, the slow stirring of life after a long, relentless winter. Let the memory of the frost, the hush of snow, and the tender resilience of those who lived through it drift softly into your mind. The city rests now, scarred yet alive, beneath the forgiving light of spring, and you too may rest, carried gently into a quiet, peaceful sleep. Perhaps you can hear the faint drip of melting ice from rooftops, a quiet rhythm that marks the passing of days. The cobblestones glisten where puddles catch the light of morning, and every step is accompanied by the soft splash or crunch beneath boots. People move slowly, deliberately, savoring the return of a world softened by fall, aware of how long the frost had held them in a quiet, unyielding grip. In homes, the air carries a mixture of scents, wood smoke curling lazily from chimneys, the faint sweetness of baking bread, and the earthy perfume of soil softened by melting snow. Families gather at hearths, exchanging words and gestures heavy with relief and gratitude. A shared blanket, a tender smile, or a careful hand guiding a child across icy thresholds becomes a quiet celebration of warmth, care, and endurance. Even the smallest streets hum softly with life once again. Merchants tend their modest stalls, arranging goods with a newfound patience. Children laugh and run, their voices fragile echoes in alleys still lined with remnants of frost. Every movement, every sound, every scent is imbued with the memory of what has been survived, and in these details, a gentle rhythm of life returns, slow and steady, to the city that endured the winter's longest shadow. Perhaps you notice the subtle return of color in the world. Roof tiles, once gray beneath the frost, now gleam with damp richness. Wooden shutters, cracked and warped by ice, show the warmth of sunlight in every crease. Even the stone of the streets, softened by snow and thaw, seems to glow faintly, carrying the memory of cold winters past and the promise of gentler days to come. People move with care and quiet joy. A baker kneads dough slowly, the warmth of the oven a small sanctuary against lingering chills. A child, cheeks pink from cold, runs barefoot across patches of softened snow, laughter curling through the alleys like smoke from a chimney. Neighbors pause to exchange simple words, greetings, encouragement, shared wonder at the light returning to the city. Every interaction is small, yet carries the weight of months survived, the subtle proof that life endures through hardship. Even the air itself seems to shift. It is softer now, less sharp and biting. The faint scent of thawed earth mingles with lingering smoke, and a quiet wind stirs through the streets, playful and teasing rather than relentless. It is a gentle reminder that winter, though powerful and demanding, eventually gives way to spring, and that the frozen city, once still and heavy, breathes once more with a rhythm both familiar and new. Perhaps you imagine stepping closer to the river, its surface now broken into gentle ripples where ice has loosened its grip. The water glimmers like scattered gems, catching the pale sunlight and carrying it softly down the winding course of the city. Along its edges, small shoots of green push through the melting snow, a quiet herald of life returning, fragile yet insistent. People gather near the banks, cautiously at first, dipping hands or buckets into the clear, cold water. Their faces, once tight with concern and the strain of survival, now relax in the simple act of drawing life from the thawing river. Children kneel at the edge, tracing shapes in the soft mud and puddles, their laughter a delicate counterpoint to the faint, steady murmur of the flowing water. Perhaps you notice how even the smallest gestures now feel profound. A mother smoothing a child's damp hair, a baker handing a loaf to a neighbor, the quiet nod of acknowledgement between two travelers meeting on the softened cobblestones. Each one is a gentle testament to the endurance of life and the warmth that persists despite months of frost. The city itself seems to exhale, a deep, slow sigh after the long, relentless hold of winter. Smoke rises in steady ribbons from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of wood and hearth throughout alleys still glimmering with remnants of ice. Puddles reflect the gentle light, shimmering with the quiet memories of frozen days and the soft hope of renewal. Even the sounds are softened now. Footsteps echo faintly, laughter drifts through alleys in delicate waves, and the distant murmur of water over thawed stones blends into a lullaby of resilience. Each moment carries a quiet poetry, a rhythm that is both soothing and profound, encouraging the mind to linger, to breathe, and to recognize the quiet strength found in survival, connection, and the slow, steady return of life after the harshest of winters. Perhaps you imagine the gentle sway of trees as spring air begins to drift through the city. Branches, once brittle and bare beneath frost, now flex and shimmer with the earliest hints of green. Droplets clinging to leaves and twigs like tiny, glistening jewels. The sun filters softly through these newly awakened branches, painting the streets in dappled light, a quiet celebration of warmth, returning after months of stillness. People move slowly, savoring each step along streets softened by melting snow. Their voices are low and gentle, each word carrying the weight of shared endurance and relief. Children run with cautious joy, testing puddles and muddy patches, while neighbors exchange small gifts of food, warmth, or simply a quiet smile. Every interaction hums with life, a gentle pulse reminding all who move through the city that even after the coldest, most relentless winter, connection endures. The rivers, once locked in icy stillness, now murmur softly, carrying with them the subtle music of flowing water. Birds return to rooftops and trees, their songs tentative at first, then gaining confidence as the days grow warmer. Even the faint scent of earth, sweetened by thaw and rain, drifts through streets and alleys, wrapping the city in a soft embrace that speaks of renewal, hope, and the delicate, persistent beauty of life emerging once more. Perhaps you pause for a moment and notice the quiet rhythm of the city now. Footsteps splash gently through puddles, their sound soft yet steady, a reminder that life continues. Merchants arrange their stalls with careful patience, the scent of fresh bread and herbs mingling with the faint fragrance of melting snow. Children chase each other through alleyways, their laughter light and fleeting, a delicate echo of joy that seems to settle in every corner. Inside homes, fires burn with a steady warmth, and families gather in soft clusters. The act of sharing a meal, of tending to one another, carries new weight after months of hardship. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word is amplified by the memory of frost, hunger, and quiet struggle. In this way, the city hums with a soft energy, a gentle pulse that speaks of resilience, community, and the tender endurance of human life. Even the natural world seems to join in this slow celebration. Trees sway softly in the spring breeze, droplets of melted ice falling to the streets below, while the first buds of new growth push through the softened earth. Birds flit between branches, their songs hesitant at first, then growing bolder as the city awakens. The air itself feels different now, lighter, warmer, and filled with the faint, soothing scent of thawed earth and firewood. Every sense is touched, every moment imbued with a quiet, comforting rhythm, inviting the listener to breathe, linger, and rest. Perhaps you notice how even the smallest sounds carry weight now. The drip of water from a thawing rooftop, the faint scrape of a cartwheel over softened cobblestones, the whisper of leaves stirring in a gentle breeze. Each one becomes a quiet reminder of life, returning after months of frozen stillness. These subtle rhythms, delicate and persistent, wrap the city in a calming cadence, a slow heartbeat that carries the memory of endurance and survival. People move with a newfound ease. A mother guides her child along the streets, their boots splashing lightly in puddles, their laughter mingling with the distant murmur of water over stones. Merchants arrange their goods, the scent of fresh bread and herbs drifting outward, reaching neighbors and passers-by like a warm, invisible embrace. Even those who had endured the coldest, harshest months now walk with gentle confidence, aware of their resilience and the quiet, tender bonds that had carried them through the winter. The city itself seems to breathe softly. Smoke rises in lazy spirals from chimneys, curling into the gentle sunlight, filtering through newly leafing trees. The rivers, once locked in ice, now flow with a quiet murmur, reflecting light across the streets and alleys in gentle ripples. Birds sing with careful abandon, their songs threading through the sounds of returning life, while the faint scent of earth, warmed by the sun, drifts through the air, carrying whispers of renewal, hope, and the enduring beauty of the world after frost. Perhaps you imagine the quiet corners of the city where life has returned more subtly. In narrow alleyways, puddles reflect soft light, birds hop between stones, and the faint rustle of wind through thawing leaves brings a gentle, calming rhythm. Every small motion, a cat padding softly across a courtyard, the flutter of a bird's wing, a child's careful step on wet cobblestone, carries the quiet magic of life slowly returning after long months of frost. Inside homes, the warmth of hearth fires spreads slowly through rooms, casting flickering shadows that dance upon walls and ceilings. Families share soft words and small gestures, tending to each other with a patience born from enduring hardship. The simple act of drawing water, kneading dough, or arranging a blanket becomes a quiet ritual, a reminder that even the most ordinary tasks are imbued with the weight of survival, the tenderness of care, and the enduring pulse of daily life. The city, once rigid and frozen, now hums with gentle vitality. Rivers murmur softly, carrying light and movement across the streets. Trees sway, their branches still fragile, but strong enough to hold the faintest glimmers of green. Birds flit between rooftops, their tentative songs a gentle hymn to spring. Every sound, every scent, every flicker of light reminds the city's inhabitants, and perhaps the listener, that life, fragile and persistent, has returned, slow, soft, and comforting in its quiet resilience. And now, as the light of spring settles fully over the city, the streets, the rooftops, and the softly flowing rivers carry a calm, enduring rhythm. The frost has long departed, leaving only faint traces, reminders of the months that tested every breath, every step, and every quiet act of care. Families move through homes and alleys with a gentle ease. Neighbors share soft smiles and kind words, and the city itself seems to sigh, a slow ending. Contented exhale that whispers of resilience, warmth, and life reclaimed. Perhaps, as you listen, you feel yourself carried along with this rhythm, wrapped in the gentle pulse of a world restored. Imagine the air soft against your skin, the faint scent of thawed earth and burning wood drifting lazily around you, the quiet laughter of children, the murmur of rivers, the soft songs of birds returning to the trees. Life persists, dear listener, fragile yet unwavering, and in this persistence, there is comfort, wonder, and a quiet, enduring peace. Before you drift fully into this gentle sleep, remember that stories like these are shared not just to inform, but to carry you softly into dreams, to linger in the imagination, and to remind us all of the quiet strength found in endurance and connection. If you have enjoyed this journey through the frozen city, consider subscribing to Candlelit Historian, so you may continue to wander softly through forgotten worlds, strange rituals, and cozy, eerie tales. Share this story with someone who loves history as much as you do, and allow the gentle rhythm of the past to guide even more minds into rest. And now, dear listener, let your eyes close slowly, your breath grow soft and steady, and drift with the city. The frost now melted, the warmth returned, and life, in all its tender resilience, carrying you softly into sleep.